Today's world is facing an enormous challenge. Within a century, the IPCC projects sea levels will rise up to 59 centimeters. In the longer term, sea levels may rise several meters. If we do not adapt now, the risk to coastal cities will rapidly increase. How will Alexandria be affected by a rise in the sea level? Are the people in the New York metro really safe? What about Jakarta, a city that is sinking at a rate of up to 25 centimeters a year? And what about Rotterdam? Is it resting on its laurels, trusting its imposing storm surge barrier, or is it planning for the future?
That has definitely water, you can see. It is eroded by
Arctic
water.
climatologist Conrad Steffen has worked most of his life on the behavior of glaciers and ice sheets. For 32 years, he worked in Canada and Alaska, and for the past 18 years, he has focused on Greenland. Here, he developed equipment to monitor the dynamics of the ice sheet. In 1997, he realized something was changing.
We had some instrument called GPS where we measure the velocity of the ice. And it's well known that the ice sheet moves at the same speed towards the ocean. And where our camp is, it moves every day 33 centimeters. And we realized that during the summer where we had increased melt, surface water running, suddenly the ice sheet moved faster. And since 2000, that really accelerated. So since 2000, we have every year almost a new record, a record in temperature, a record in melt, a record in the ice motion. If you look at Greenland, it can lose mass by melting. In the summer, the ice reduces just by melt, and it breaks off. And these are all these icebergs you can see out there. And we know that about 50% of the ice loss in Greenland is by this iceberg calving. And these iceberg calvings increased in the last few years because the glacier is starting to move much faster towards the coast. The latest IPCC report, the International Panel for Climate, actually predicts for by 2100 we'll have 50 plus centimeter sea level rise. This is actually a mean value which is only built on melt. That means how much ice is melting and running towards the ocean, and it includes all the glaciers, and the glaciers are currently the biggest contributor to melt. And then Greenland, Antarctica, and all these ice parts make 50% of the sea level rise out. The other 50% is the thermal expansion of the ocean, because if you warm the water, it has a bigger volume. And what we can see now is, when you predict to 2100, we already know today that more than 50% of the signal here in Greenland is by these fast-moving glaciers. That is not part of the IPCC prediction. Therefore, I would say the 59 centimeter is really the lower end of the prediction. It can easily be a meter, even 1.5 meters by 2100. And what is even worse, 2100 is not the end of our history. It continues to rise, and probably continues to rise at a faster rate than today.
Alexandria is Egypt's second largest city and largest port. The area is the most popular summer resort in the Mediterranean, and over 2 million people visit every year. Tourism and industrial activities are always good for employment, and therefore it's no wonder it's one of Egypt's fastest growing population centers. Today, over 5 million people live here.
In case of a sea level rise of 1 meter, we expect some parts of the eastern city to be directly inundated. In addition to these areas, there is a saltwater intrusion which would affect a lot of area in the region, There is problems of waterlogging and groundwater contamination, and so the whole area would be affected by sea level rise. Some parts of the beach will disappear. When the sea level rises, the rate of erosion also rises. So the situation will be enhanced, you know. So the rates of losses will be increased. And if you visit this beach during the summer, you would realize how many people would be affected. You cannot see the sand from the people who come over here for bathing and enjoying the beach.
If nothing is done, Professor El Rey expects huge losses in the tourist sector and at economic and health levels. But he also expects millions of people to abandon their homes. Many farmers, for instance, will be faced with unproductive land. They need to move to find jobs elsewhere. But Egypt is not neglecting its future challenges. It's working on beach nourishment, and there are also projects to keep the vulnerable areas safe from erosion, like the work here, done at the Abu Qir Wall. But Professor El Rey stresses this work is necessary even without the sea level rise predictions. To keep the city safe for the future, it first has to identify and fully understand the vulnerable areas.
We have been able to convince the decision makers that we have to expand the city on the highland areas, southwest of Alexandria. And these areas are relatively higher than the lowland areas to the east. I think this was a success from our side, but we still have to consider the land uses. We have to consider the upgrading of awareness, the transportation systems, and so on. There are so many aspects that needs scientific and technical development and main concern on the side of the decision makers. We are fighting for that.
While Professor El Rey is fighting to get the rise in sea levels and its impact to the top of the agendas of the decision makers, others are also fighting for their attention. Egypt's share of Nile water is not enough to meet the water demands of the population. Already, today, Alexandria falls below the water scarcity limit. As the population continues to grow and rainfall decreases due to climate change, this situation will get worse.
الحاجات دي بقى ما فيهاش. ومش هتكملوا للباقي. وليه بقى؟ عشان في صعوبة في الدخول ولا ايه؟
عشان الشوارع ضيقة.
Sadare, the Alexandrian water and sanitation companies, and Switch are here in Ma'awa El Sayadin to investigate how people use the water and how they can solve the problems they are facing every day.
المية ضعيفة وساعات بتروح ودوخنا بقى نطلع نمر من على الشارع وكده.
وساعتها بتعملوا ايه بقى؟
ساعات ناخدوا الازايز ونطلع نملوا بالازايز بالجراكل. كده.
والمجاري بقى بتطفح قد ايه كل قد ايه؟ بتلاقي مجاري بتطفح كل قد ايه مثلا؟
في الاسبوع مرتين ثلاثة.
الاسبوع مرتين ثلاثة
المجاري بتطفح.
We are trying to see how we can improve the water supply and sanitation services. We are also looking at how to reduce over usage of water, water demand management. We are also looking at recycling some of the sewage water so that we don't need bigger sewage networks within the streets.
يعني أنا الست دي 4 أيام 4 أيام أنا رامي غزلي وعيالي يعلم الله بجيب من الدكاكين ومستعد أوديك للدكاكين اللي أنا جايب منها الأكل القوت الضروري.
Lake Mariut is one of the biggest surface water bodies in Alexandria. Fishermen depend on the lake, but due to seawater and sewage water, lake water quality is severely deteriorating. Sadare is also looking at ways to treat the sewage water in order to improve the quality of the lake.
زاد البوص زراعته زادت منه لمحشة المية. التقاوى بتاعتها بتطلع على مؤاخذة من المية اللي بتترمى البراز والحاجات دي وبتاع مش عارف كيماويات جامدة قوي.
أصبح سماد للبوص ده ساعد توسع البوص خلاها زي
هقول لسيادتك حاجة ادي بره طالعة فيه.
ما هو لا طب وإذا شال الملوثات وسد مساحة المية يبقى الصياد هيعدي يصطاد منين؟
هنعمله إيه؟
لازم بقى يتشال شوية منه.
لازم يتشال البوص إزالة الحشائش.
The government is facing a huge dilemma. What will they spend their money on? Should they give priority to today's challenges, or should they invest it for the future, as huge amounts will be necessary to protect the city against the rise in sea levels?
What would be more certain? The fact that the fishermen in the village do not have water and sanitation services, the fact that the quality of their fishing water is not that good, or the uncertainty about the possible seawater rise in the next 100 years. The level of uncertainty is different, so that's why I think that investment priorities should be put on the high priority or more certain facts and challenges that we are facing at the moment.
That's where the water found its way in and actually drops down here and then connects underneath with the other channels we have seen. That's why we hear all this roaring. There's much more water coming from the basin. And see, the ice is moving here about 20 centimeters per day. So over a season, it's 150 meters. That's where the lowest point is, so about 150 meters uphill is last year's entry. You have to come in front. This is a snow bridge. I do see that policymakers get more interested in the problem. They want to know more, because now they get worried. Because it's not just, yeah, we have a little bit sea level rise. It is, how much is it and how quickly is it coming? Even the US has a lot of coastline that is very close to the sea level. Take Florida, take the big cities like New York, that is very close to the sea level. And if you have 50 centimeters increase, the whole subway system will be underwater. And there are different countries will cope with it differently, but it affects all nations. It's global.
New York, the Big Apple. Everyone wants to have a piece of it, but now the water is demanding its part. With an estimated sea level rise of 1 meter, New York is facing an increasing threat from the sea.
The risk for New York City is very real. In fact, New York City has already been flooded. In the 1950s, there was a big flood. In 1992, there was a winter storm that flooded, and actually a subway station in New Jersey just behind me, across the river, filled up with seawater. Seawater is very corrosive. It conducts electricity, so the whole electric subway system was shut down for up to 10 days. Trains were trapped under the Hudson River behind me. It was very serious. And you can see here that the ocean has come up and flooded those cars that are trying to get down the highway. This is a famous photograph. This is the Hoboken subway station, and you can see the water cascading down the stairs. That's not rainwater, that's the ocean. So it is a real possibility, and it's just really a disaster waiting to happen. The chances of it happening are small, but if it does happen, the consequences are very large.
Every day, millions of people rely on the subway. And because of its vulnerability to flooding, it's necessary to adapt, but adaptation plans take time to implement.
We're walking towards a new subway station that's been built called South Ferry. It's underground, of course. It's a $500 million project, and it's nearly completed. The construction is still going on. This is maybe three meters above sea level. It's very vulnerable to flooding, and it could easily be flooded with a Category 2 or Category 3 hurricane. It's built to withstand a 100-year storm, but we could have a 100-year storm next week, next month. So it just depends what the risk is, you see. So I would have thought that in this discussion of climate change that we would have suggested that they build the sides higher. And the same comment applies to the entrance, the passenger entrance across the street here. It's also very low. It's right close to the water's edge. You can just see the hole in the ground where passengers will go down. Well, the city likes to keep the subway entrances at street level. So people come off the street, they go straight into the subway, and people don't like having to climb up and then down again to go down a hole in the ground. And so it's a convenience factor, but it would seem to me it would be safer if they'd built the entrance up 1 or 2 meters, and it would be easy to do, and now's the time to do it.
The Metropolitan Transport Authority is well aware of the vulnerability of their transport system. A commission investigated what needs to be done and came up with a set of recommendations. They are working hard to get the cooperation of the city and the government, but adaptation is still at an early stage.
It's no question that the new things that we build will take into consideration all of the climate adaptation forecast. And, you know, we're a part of several working groups along with the City of New York and the State of New York to reach a set of shared assumptions about what the risk is in 2020 and what the risk is in 2050. So as we build new facilities or renovate old facilities, we'll take all of this into account. It was built to meet certain standards, probably for a 100-year flood. But, you know, the United States in general, including this region, hasn't spent a lot of time quantifying climate adaptation. The U.S., to some degree, has only really begun to focus on climate mitigation, right? Reducing greenhouse gases. And all the talk in the U.S. really is focused on reducing greenhouse gases. Climate adaptation is not as an exciting subject as climate mitigation and greenhouse gases. And so the U.S. and this region have not been as, shall we say, as swift as people in the EU and people in Japan to really begin to focus on climate adaptation. But we hope to catch up. We think that there's a lot to learn from Japan, from the Netherlands, and to some degree, probably even from Venice.
Imagine an extreme storm hit New York. Not only would New Yorkers be impacted, the whole world would feel the effects, and the economic chaos would be felt globally. Jeroen Arts is professor at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam and studies the impact of climate change on coastal cities in the world. In New York, he meets his colleague, Malcolm Bowman.
How vulnerable is it exactly then? I mean, how far are we from the sea here?
The front door of the New York Stock Exchange is maybe 2 or 3 meters above high tide level.
Okay.
So it's a low probability, but it could happen that we could have flooding right here on the Stock Exchange, on the floor down here.
But who is responsible then, I mean, for the safety of Wall Street? I mean, is it Wall Street? Is it the city of New York?
Well, this is
the
New York Stock Exchange is a private company, and it's on private property. They own the property.
Right.
They assume the risk of being where they are.
Right.
And presumably they have insurance against flood damage, which may or may not be adequate.
Yeah.
And in 50 years, 100 years from now, it certainly would not be adequate if we can expect sea level to rise.
Right.
So it's really the risk of the New York Stock Exchange. However, the implications of a shutdown of great damage is worldwide.
That's
so
true.
You might say, well, the city of New York has some responsibility.
And have they? I mean, have they responsibility? Are they planning anything to protect this neighborhood?
Well, I think there is concern, growing awareness of the problems of climate change. And the mayor of New York City is very aware of this now, and he set up a panel, a climate panel, to advise him on what the city should be doing, what should be planning. So it's late, it's slow, but it's growing.
Malcolm Bowman is part of the New York climate change panel set up by Mayor Bloomberg. and advises the city on the best way to act to keep the city safe for the future.
We could build seawalls all around the island, but then you have to remember the areas at risk are much more than just Manhattan. We have Queens in front of me, we have Brooklyn, we have New Jersey behind me. We have maybe 1,200 kilometers of coastline that needs to be protected. So that's a huge expense to think about. Another way that we've been investigating is to build large storm barriers, much like you have in the Netherlands, in the New Waterway, etc., and the Delta project. And there are several areas that we could build these large barriers that would be removable down what we call the Verrazano Narrows at the entrance of New York Harbor. And then we call the East River, connects to Long Island Sound. And then there would need to be a third barrier behind Staten Island. And if we want to protect Brooklyn, if we want to protect Kennedy Airport, we'd need a fourth barrier. So we're actively researching the barrier concept. We're talking to the city about it. It's a big project, it's a big commitment. It would be very expensive. And the government, of course, wants to be sure that it's the right way to go.
Jeroen Arts studied the costs involved to adapt. Data over the last decades shows that losses due to coastal floods have dramatically increased. According to him, however, there is time to react, and money shouldn't be an issue.
By 2050,